All right, folks. Again, hi everybody who just joined. I'm Trevor Kerwin, Director of Partnerships at Shiva.ai. Thanks again for joining us today for this. It's our sixth webinar we've done. We try to do one of these every quarter. Smart cities to wise cities: how EVs will change city infrastructure for the better. Very happy to be joined today by two great guests: Doug Davenport, founder of Prospect SV, and Gary King, CEO of the EV Alliance. Thanks to those guys for joining us. Yes, we will be a little bit about today's webinar. For those of you who've never joined before, a little bit of housekeeping. We want this to be an immersive experience for everybody who's here today. So we will be presenting, talking a little bit about setting the table about best practices and what we see in the EV, how cities and city planning will intersect with the required build out of EV infrastructure. We know that that's a big deal as we go forward and building will be a key component of smart cities. We're going to, I'll have Doug come up first and give a little bit about some of his perspectives in working with smart cities on that front. And then Gary will also present at that point afterwards to talk a little bit about some of the best practices he's seen, some of the work he's done in the past as well. Then we'll be doing a roundtable of questions with me and Gary and Doug. And again, we really want this to be interactive for everybody. Anybody who's joined us before know that we really relish what we get back from our audience. So feel free to ask questions. In the you'll see a Q&A button, or you should see a Q&A button on your screen. Feel free to ask the questions in there. Then we'll address them at the end of the discussion as well. So everybody knows, all the attendees are muted, so you don't have to worry about that on your end. And for folks who may want to send this on to colleagues or whatever in the future, you will have there should be a recording available within a week. Generally, we post them on our YouTube channel as well, so you'll be able to send that on to your colleagues who might not have been able to make it today. So with that, I would like to throw it over to Doug Davenport, founder of Prospect SV. Doug, come on up. Tell us a little bit about yourself, first of all, and Prospect SV, and then give us some of your perspectives on where you see EV infrastructure challenges for sort of in the public policy or public planning environment.
Sure. So I'm going to virtually come up to the stand and shuffle my papers around for a second nervously, right? Do you miss those days? I'm not sure we do, but this is great. I really appreciate being here.
Yes.
And Trevor, I guess just before I start, I was wondering how many guests do we have today? So I kind of know, am I talking to a big room or a little room?
It's probably, I think we had about 20, 25 registrants.
Great.
So think of it that size.
Wonderful, perfect size. So it's great that y'all came to hear us, and I hope that you find this hour enriching. I guess I want to start with this. I'm fairly sure that none of us have exactly the same idea of what a smart city is. And if we were to bring everybody into a room with just the words "What is a smart city?" written on the board in the front of the meeting, we could spend an entire day and have probably nothing more than a framework on how we should agree. So it does, this is a really formative concept, but I love the title of Smart Cities to Wise Cities, because I think that's the big goal. And fortunately, we're not talking about the whole system. We're talking about electric vehicles. So, the other thing is, the reason I think that's true is because every piece of marketing literature I've ever seen on smart cities looks like the product set that the company who made it is selling, right? So it's the wild frontier, and we're trying to decide what a smart city can be. And I think we're also going to be having a discussion on whether a smart city should be run by a city, or if a smart city is a collection of services that are run by others. Interesting debate. For me, smart cities aren't just replacing something that's dumb with something that's smart for the sake of doing it. I think it's fundamentally rewiring to optimize the benefit to the people that are in that city, that are working in that city, visiting that city, or living in that city. And when it comes to electric vehicles, I think that rewiring is literally rewiring. I think that electric vehicles can fundamentally shift power infrastructure and shift power and energy services across a city, hopefully in a way that's really going to benefit the people that are there. So, a couple of things I want to just open with on that idea is, as electric vehicles increase demand, we have to rethink energy supply and demand. We have to think about physical location of charging systems. We have to think of the value of the electric vehicle and how it contributes to a smart city. Not just the fact that it's electric and it has a big old battery that it's rolling around with, but the fact that vehicle technology is moving forward and creating more spatially aware, environmentally aware systems in and of themselves, that can be part of that picture. So there's a lot going on in this where electric vehicles can have a role to play. I think one of the things that we really two big things that we think about at Prospect Silicon Valley when it comes to this picture. One, the economy's going to move quickly for those that are kind of situated to acquire and monetize these kinds of systems. So the commercial market's going to move a lot faster than the public market. There's been some public charging, but you can see that picture is changing. I'm sure Shiva could talk about this all day long. But cities themselves actually represent a fairly large amount of any state or any national economy. And their own assets need to be part of this picture. And so we look at, well, how can we help the public sector move forward with charging systems, move forward with electric vehicle fleets, and make that an important central part of the picture of what a smart city can be. That's a really difficult problem for them because of special constraints that are placed on local governments. Believe it or not, it's much harder to do the right thing when you've got the rule book sitting in front of you. And so, those that have moved forward early have done so kind of at their own peril. So the term that I use a lot is the early adopter penalty. We always think about the early adopter benefits, but cities in California, like Berkeley, where I'm sitting today, really moved quickly to acquire electric vehicles and build charging infrastructure. In the early days, electricians weren't exactly totally up on how you do this correctly, and we didn't really have the design down exactly right. There are installation problems, there are intelligence problems, there are siting problems. There's a lot that happens when you move forward quickly that you'd love to rethink. The hazard there isn't, oh darn, we didn't do it right and we can do it right now. It's that can create a headwind that you have to work against politically, financially, operationally, and you have to really. So we have to find ways to get past the early adopter penalty and maintain momentum. That's something that we're thinking of a lot because the goal has to remain where it is. Number two, and then I'm going to turn it back to you, Trevor, is like I said, the free market's going to move quickly, right? Delivery networks are going electric. We're seeing new news about this all the time. You're seeing the consumer market moving electric really quick. You're seeing Taco Bell is building charging stations to serve customers, right? The issue is the free market doesn't reach every corner. And there's a lot of talk about equity. Equitable infrastructure matters, right? The thing is, I don't really love the term equity in this case because I don't like the idea that technology is something that should be argued as good or better for those who have versus those who haven't. I think about infrastructure needing to be comprehensive. For it to be comprehensive, we have to have forethought and we have to think about the services that are needed and the very site-specific, let's say, infrastructure required to work, irrespective of the zip code. And so, that the other area that I think has to be rethought when we're thinking about smart cities to wise cities here is making sure that the smart city is comprehensively beneficial. to everybody that's in that city. So those are two big things that I wanted to bring in, is that, you know, the difficulties of cities actually performing for themselves, and the fact that this vision has to be comprehensive, and we have to be thinking edge to edge when we think about these problems.
Fantastic. Fantastic points there, Doug. And obviously, you know, that is the kind of it's tough to be it's can be challenging. We'll get into this in the discussion, but it's challenging in some of the time frames for cities to think that way. But thanks for the thanks for those points. And Gary, I'd like to bring up Gary, of course, now for the CEO of the EV Alliance. And Gary, I know you had some of the things you have in hand right now with your day job, not just speaking on webinars like this, is to look at, or is that you've kind of come with some best practices around how cities might think about this kind of infrastructure integration. So please, Gary King from the EV Alliance.
Thank you, Trevor. I appreciate being on here and pairing me with someone like Doug and his level of respect that he has in the industry. I really appreciate it. Yes, in fact, I have some fresh information I can reference, because I'm actually working with two clients that are they're claimed to be smart cities that are struggling, and they're struggling because they really don't know what to do, and they did. And not to plug ourselves, but they need to reach out to more in industry that have been through this, that have the experience and expertise, because you can really get dragged behind. I could give you one example. One city has had their smart city plan done for a little over 2 years now, and they're just now going out with their very first RFP for charging stations. And it's not because they were indecisive. It's just there's so much involved in making those type of decisions. And I think one of the challenges that cities experience right off the bat is how they don't engage the community and the business leaders. So when we're talking about best practices, one of the things I focus on heavily when I go into these cities is pulling together all the stakeholders and getting them together and understanding what they see as the wants and needs of the city, and then narrowing it down to the necessities and so forth. And I think the engagement part of it is the key. And you're also having to collaborate with business leaders and organizations and engage, you know, individuals from different demographics of the city. One example being, we have a community that says, "What do we need charges for? I don't even have a car. I can't afford a car." And another community saying that, you know, what do we need to have Wi-Fi for, because I already have Comcast and this and so forth. So there's various needs throughout, and there's also things like security and lighting and all those types of things. But one example that we've dealt with recently is looking at mass transportation and bringing in more shuttles that are electric vehicles, and to those areas that are disadvantaged, bringing in Wi-Fi so they can apply for jobs and so forth. But overall, it really comes down to how you interact in the beginning, who you engage, ensuring that you have clear transparency, and no doubt there's a lot of politics. You'll find that various individuals in key positions have their agenda, and they know what they want to do. And one of them might want to get charging stations, the other one wants to get street lighting or security cameras or license plate readers or something like that. So it's getting them all in the same place and identifying the priorities and so forth. But the reality is that we all know that the majority of people are moving towards the metro area. I think by 2050, it's like 60% of the population is going to be in cities. So it's spreading fast. Fortunately, where those early adopters have helped us, because we can look and see what they've accomplished. And of course, Europe has been very well ahead of us in their cities and adopting smart cities and so forth. But you know, the San Francisco, New York City, there's so many that are already out there that are already far ahead. And thinking of New York City, for an example, and this comes up a lot, and I know that you're both familiar with this as a potential area of questioning and so forth, is San Francisco, for example. It's like they get a majority of their fines support them. So what are you going to do when you replace? How are you? Well, what we've determined, we decided or learned here in the Chicago area is through addressing these concerns is fines are reactive, but charging stations and credit cards and having Shiva's technology and so forth is proactive. So, you know, when you're charging somebody for the charge, it's happening then. They're not going after them after the fact of parking and so forth. So we're seeing a lot of positive feedback from the local community as well as our public representatives, our community government representatives, as far as seeing that as helping them in those areas of losing potential revenue and actually gaining revenue. Something else that's just come up, which is kind of surprising. I'm getting more cities asking about media towers. How can they establish media towers for the charging stations for ads for events and shows and functions? And you know, there's so many uses for that. So we're getting more and more requests for that. But overall, it's really factoring in the potential political implications, the politics, the building a solid network, communicating, being transparent, engaging often. Those are all what I would call best practices. And we're seeing more immediate results for this one city as an example, what they were able to accomplish in 2 years versus the past 2 months. So that's just an example of some things. And I could add more. I could probably talk all day about some of the challenges that you face out there that you might want to think about doing differently.
Well, and that you could save that for the discussion piece. We're going to thank you very much for setting the table for us on that. And that what you guys brought up. We're going to talk about this in more detail. But what I just wanted to sort of hone down on this idea. What you both just talked about. I'm struck by having worked in and around smart cities between IoT and distributed energy, and now with Shiva, this idea of there's a 50,000 foot view conversation we often have about smart cities, quote unquote, and to which point I think somebody in frustration said, I think the only people where I was speaking at an event, they said in frustration to me, I think the only people making money in smart cities right now are people who hold smart cities conferences. I'm glad to add to that today with another webinar. But the idea of that, that sort of, yay, let's talk about policy. And at the other end, there's a lot of really talented, call them whatever you want, chief innovation officers or whatever, at cities who are actually just taking stuff, hardware, and putting it in the wild and really testing a lot of the tech companies that offered smart cities, like overarching smart city solutions. I'm not going to call anyone out here, but that idea of like, here's the box on the pole that does the magic thing. And they're like, yeah, that's great. That's yesterday. What have you done for me today? I need these lines repainted. Gary, to your point, I need visual stuff that shows what's going on in this neighborhood. I need to know where traffic is changing for an event and without having, there's a lot of like what streetlights are burnt out without having a truck drive around and look for burnt out streetlights, or somebody calling and complaining about a burnout streetlight, right, which is a really bad customer outcome. And that idea of cities not knowing enough about their residents or visitors beyond taxes and fines and things like that, right? That again, not great customer experiences if you think about it. That idea is really interesting. And I just want to jump in and say a little bit, folks, if you've come to our events before and you know a little bit about Shiva, our role in this is, we have an in-car payments commerce solution that introduces this concept of vehicle location-based services to monetizing the driver experience as cars get more connected and more autonomous down the road as well. But we have a patented, very precise geolocation technology that can tell you where your car is within 2 meters. Why is that important? I pull up to a gas pump, an EV charging station, a drive-through, parking meter, and it identifies the car, and you can do the transaction from within the car, no phones, no anything else. So that's where our interest lies in this. And we work with the OEMs directly on that, of course, or that's what we're working on now, but also with the service providers. And so for this discussion, and we'll get into our group discussion now, is, for our experience, we provide these services. You're plugging in your EV charger, you got 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever it is. There's other things you're going to want to do at that time. We enable those to, whether you're paying for the parking or paying for entry into a special area, or having something delivered to your car from a nearby retail outlet or food or whatever it is, we can enable that. So for us, we're really interested in building that ecosystem. And so I wanted to start, and these are a lot of new concepts that both you guys have mentioned and I've discussed now. Let's kick it off with something a little bit fun. You both laid out some interesting issues around, excuse me, smart cities and EV charging infrastructure. You picture yourself at a conference. I'm going to go to Doug and then to Gary. You've literally got 5 seconds of the mayor of New York City's time, or it doesn't have to be New York City. You pick the mayor you most would love to talk to about what you're doing. You've got 5 seconds of their time in passing. What's the thing you shout to them that they need to be worried about at this Smart Cities conference? And Doug, I'll start with you.
So my answer is a little different. Actually, this is a real story. I won't mention the mayor's name, but it was a big city mayor. He directly asked me in this meeting, what should I be doing today, and to help make this goal real. And I said, stop making decisions that push the goalpost back.
Interesting.
Okay. Now we can unpack that, right? But and he got it right away. He's like, okay, I keep leaning on the policies we have instead of questioning the policies, and we keep making the same purchases because it's safe. We need to start to divert and we need to commit to a different path. And the earlier we commit, the better off we're going to be.
A little bit of what I've heard somebody refer to as innovation constipation on that. Sometimes it happens, I think, is a safe way to do it. It's a safe way it's easy to keep saying, let's not act by, or let's act by not acting.
Well, and it's transferring that energy of as Gary said, innovation that kind of feels good, right? It's all that kind of external, oh, look, we're innovative, right? And all those CIOs that got hired that were just supposed to find something new all the time. Sorry for the hand waving. You got to translate that energy into something practical and reasonable and principled that's going to actually move you forward, even if it's not as visibly cool.
Fair enough. And Gary, what would you blurt out?
Well, I'll use an example too, and I won't mention the mayor. In my situation, I was actually at a public forum and had been trying to make contact with the mayor, and I was given an opportunity to ask him a question, and so I did. I asked him, when can you be available to meet with community leaders and stakeholders to talk about your smart city plan? It put him on the spot, but he committed to it, and you know what? That it paid off, because within 2 weeks we had our first meeting. So that's what I would always go after, is trying to put them on the spot to connect with somebody, because they're very hard to get to make decisions. They tend to, and this is no disrespect to mayors or their legal department, but they tend to defer to their legal department as a way of postponing things, and I've seen that as well. So I would also hope that at that same meeting is their legal rep as well, to get him involved.
Yeah. So start by talking to the general counsel for the city.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, great, and that's the reality. I think, as somebody explained to me about fixing JFK Airport, the head of the port of the New York, New Jersey Port Authority at one point said, like, we're imploding Terminal 4, and then we need, it's like you're doing open heart surgery on a patient that's running a marathon. Like, we can't just shut JFK for 12 months and make it really nice for you, right? And it's challenging. So for cities to say, like, oh, here's this new thing, look over here, they're going to say, okay, when I'm done everything else, I'll go do that, right? So that is a real challenge. Like you said, Gary, it can be a real challenge. But that said, let's think about what exists right now on the ground in terms of EV charging infrastructure. And right now, most of us see that publicly as the charger networks, EVgo, Volta, Electrify America, whatever the certain name here of the charger networks. Do you, if you think about how that integrates into what a city might be doing, I don't want to be mean, but are they necessary? Will this be something that gets white labeled? Like, will it, as often with the case with like publicly owned assets in this case, we're gonna, you're either contracting to build the infrastructure and someone else owns it and you lease it, or it's going to be publicly owned. Who is the best asset manager for this? And will cities like kind of just like fill around some of the hardware maybe they've already built themselves for their own fleet management purposes or whatever? Like, and I'll start, Gary, with you on that. If you got an idea on that.
Well, I could, from my experience, especially in the state of Illinois, a lot of it's kicking off by to see what the federal government's doing with grants and incentives and so forth. But for example, one city I'm working with, they're focusing first on the corridors. Along with the federal, every 50 miles a charging station, but they're taking it one step further and not only trying to get those DC fast chargers right off the expressway so people will come into the city, but getting into the level 2 so they can draw them further in, take a little bit longer to charge, go see a show, do some shopping and so forth. So that's the priority that I see a lot of the cities here in Illinois facing is, okay, it's kind of like thinking of the federal government as their financer. There's a lot of cities that won't make decisions unless they know they're going to be qualifying for some types of tax incentives of some sort. And same with the businesses. So we rely very heavily on staying in front of what is out there, what funding is out there, and so forth. But we're already, like, even though the city is starting to look at DC fast chargers, and also they have a transportation hub they're going to be filling in, the businesses are starting to call. I've been working with the local chamber of commerce, and they having business leaders saying, we don't want to wait for the city. We want to get these in now. We have people asking about at our hotel, do we have a charger? And they're choosing other hotels possibly because we don't. So I see a lot of it focusing on supply, the demand, but also facing the challenges of supply. We're all aware of the supply chain of getting these products, these equipment manufactured and delivered on time. There's a lot of backlog and those types of things. So that drives it too.
It's an interesting point too, because it's not cheap, that infrastructure, like a fast charger. It's not, and so, maybe it is a place for public-private partnerships or some model on the revenue stream. But Doug, what do you think about on that front?
Yeah, so I mean, it's tricky, right? Because the analog to or whatever you would call it, the corresponding idea to a charging station would be a gas station, and there are no city-run gas stations, right? Or at least not for the public. So, so the only other thing we can rely on is a parking spot, right? So we think of it as parking. So I think. I think that where commercial entities want to have EV charging, and I think that infrastructure is going to lag. It's easier to buy an electric car than it is to build charging infrastructure. I think on the public services side, I think if they can rely on public-private partnerships in order to expand infrastructure and somehow use that as a bundle that with the public parking picture, right? Which in itself I'm kind of avoiding because it's really complicated, right? Certainly they can be looking at that. I think that in terms of making sure that infrastructure is available, I mean, certainly, the US DOE set forth guidelines for cities to fast track permitting of solar. I do not know, perhaps Gary does, whether such kind of comprehensive guidance exists for EV charging. But in the case that it does not yet, and I don't think it does, certainly that could help. That, look, if you're going to install a charger of this type with this kind of system, as long as you demonstrate these 3 things, your permit's going to take 4 days. We have to go there with things like this, because I think that the basic systems are basic enough and are needed enough that we have to do that, right? I think the other thing, and let's not forget the city fleets themselves. City fleets. Chicago most likely has thousands of vehicles and an incredibly complex set of vehicles. So charging is very complicated. In California, we are drowning in incentive money for charging systems and things like that. The issue is the terms around those charging systems sometimes make it almost impossible for cities to take advantage of them. So there's a city in California, Fremont, that we love very much. Great city, doing great things with electric vehicles. They are electrifying their police fleet. Really hard problem. The issue is the incentives that they can get a hold of in order to make get that infrastructure in the ground requires that the systems be fully publicly accessible. You can't do it. We don't want that, right? So so they have to find ways to work around it. So I think, again, public-private partnerships come into play because the natural kind of system of incentives and money and process don't allow it, and they're going to be looking at alternatives until they can catch up. So I think we're in this very undefined space right now.
It really is. It's thinking about well, yeah, and there, it's not just the infrastructure itself or how you roll it out. And of course, in this particular case, as you just pointed out, there's federal, state, and municipal concerns about using a piece of a shared infrastructure. So you got to think about, like, you think about electricity or the power grid or roads, right? Who has the responsibility? And then those things that happen at the margin are like, oh, why hasn't this 10 miles of road been paved in the last 10 years? Well, because they're arguing about whose highway it is, right? And whose therefore whose responsibility it is.
Oh, it's a mess.
And so that's challenging. Those intersections are really challenging. At the same time, it's not like it is with roads where I've got a car, my dad had a car, I have a car, my kid has a car, the car all works the same. You get in it, you drive on the asphalt, hopefully it's nice and smooth. Now we're also factoring in user adoption curves on a technology, on EVs. And the biggest, well, if you look at sort of, I think I just saw one yesterday from Bloomberg. Biggest concerns about adoption of EV is still a range issue, right? Can I charge it? I'm worried about where can I charge it. We're out of the early adopter phase where, if I could afford an EV, I could probably had a house, therefore I probably had a place to plug it in. Or if I'm a fleet user, it's return to base, right? So there's there's charging infrastructure just for me. And as we move into this thing of like, no, we need this stuff in public too. And getting people over that fear of, will I be able to plug in? Okay, now smart city, you have allayed my fears about being able to get energy when I need it for my car. How do I, and it takes a while for that charging to happen. It's a longer fueling experience. It's measured in minutes. It takes me 2 minutes to pump gas into a car, roughly, let's call it. You're talking multiples of that to potentially whatever you need to charge and what kind of charging station you have. So what do I do now that I've allayed the EV driver's biggest fear in my city of making sure that their car will be able to operate to get home? What else can I provide them? Because that charging event is so, relatively speaking, long. What can I do with my quote downtime in the car? Are you seeing any cities taking advantage of that? Gary, maybe a little bit off what you said about Volta's charging stations there's an ad-driven piece of it, so there's a big screen that goes with the charger. A city could use the thing that you were saying to say, like, hey, there's a baseball game, either don't park here right now or go do something else, or whatever it is, messages that can communicate. And that idea of having that place to be able to do that. But that's just one little piece of servicing. Replacing a sign. What about what's available to eat around here? What about what's coming up next week? Whatever the thing. Have cities really started to explore that relationship of the attention that they've got from charging, from the length of charging events. And I'll go to Doug first on this one. I think I went Gary last time, so yes.
Darn it. That's okay. Larry, don't use that clip.
Okay. No problem.
Yeah. So
Well,
here's
we're
a couple of
working
things.
on that a while.
Yeah. Here's a couple of things. I think certainly when everybody's thinking about downtime and they're thinking of parking, I think, obviously we're all interested in bidirectional, right? It's convenient to say, well, hey, if you're parked in this parking spot, you could either be charging or, in certain events, could we, borrow some of your battery, right? For demand response and that kind of thing. And that sounds all cool, but, then it gets complicated, right? I think where there are opportunities in this space, if we're truly thinking about smart cities and not just a public parking station, is, something that Prospect Silicon Valley is hoping to be working on soon, is the concept that in a commercial building, could be a public building, could be multi-unit housing, et cetera. There are rules around where electric vehicles could be used for backup power or peak shaving or create some sort of bidirectional situation. It requires a lot of intermediating infrastructure for that to happen. In many cases, that would be cost prohibitive. And if we really want these, smart cities to be comprehensive, right, then you don't want to have to create duplicative storage and other infrastructure that is not necessarily providing value, if you can instead maximize the value of the electric vehicle that you are purchasing. Right. So if there are, and we hope to be establishing some framework for direct vehicle to building usage, not just in emergencies, but in certain cases for peak shaving, right? For demand response and otherwise. And so we think that that's a really important thing that we could be working on. And I think we got to get beyond the concept of, bidirectional is cool. And we have to think about where can it be applied that's actually going to maximize benefit.
Gary?
Yeah, the way I've been seeing it, and I'm looking at it from a smart city perspective, is we know that I think it's like 70 to 90% of electric vehicle owners charge their vehicles at home. So yes, the folks you're drawing into the cities are mostly going to be visitors, or they're people that forgot to charge their vehicle at home and they want to plug it in at work or near their work or so forth. That's why you're seeing a lot of these companies like Spark Charge and currently popping up that do scheduled services to charge your vehicle. But going back to the social media, I mean the very media screens, the media towers, we work with EV Energy Group, and what they're showing us is that the individuals that are pursuing, the companies, the cities, the businesses, like malls, for an example, are very big on bringing in those media towers, because then they can tell them, they can capture your GPS information, anonymous, not tied directly to you, and figure out where you shop and what stores you go into and how long you're there and so forth. And they could target those ads on those media towers to match that. The libraries that I'm working with are very anxious to see people know what's available in the library before they come in there, and what events are coming up at the library that they're going to be having sponsored and so forth. The Visitors Convention Bureau, same thing. They want to know, how can we put these media towers in places where people can get that information. But overall, I see that the biggest drive is going to be not only supporting fleets, of course. Like if you go to the city of Madison, almost their entire fleet is converted. They even have electric fire trucks. It's their fleet is the focus, and then I would say second is going to be the visitors, and then third would be the everyday consumers that come into the city and so forth. But everything being designed around that approach is key as far as where you locate those charging stations. And like Doug said, everybody's used to going into gas stations and so forth. We have one city that they went natural gas, and now they're looking at electric, and they realized that the demand just wasn't there for their cars, so they opened it up to the public, and that opening up to the public qualified them for more incentives so they could add on to go to electric. So it's interesting how people are piggybacking on other things that they're required to do. But that was a really good point you made earlier about the fact that you have all these requirements that these incentives have that you have to meet. And they have to be smart systems, not dumb. They have to be networked. They got to be able to communicate with them and find out when they're down and when they need to be fixed and what's wrong with them and all those types of things. So a lot of opportunities there.
And you touched on something there. Doug did as well. Oh, and one quick note, just a quick note of housekeeping, folks. Anytime for the audience, if you have a question, you can ask the question anytime. We'll address it later on. You can use the Q&A button on the screen to send us that question. But Doug's point about about demand response, and a lot of us here, that this is a lot of energy talk. My background is in energy. If we got anybody on the call today from Texas, they know what their real-time electricity headlines look like right now. That idea, though, of every car being a battery that could potentially do something to bolster the grid. It would call it whatever we're going to want to call it, but it is a power asset. Let's just leave it at that, make it that simple. I mean, for us at Shiva, it's really interesting because I know as an energy guy, the biggest challenge there is that you can't, when I tell you to go home and turn off your dishwasher because there's an electricity event, well, it depends on you, A, reading that, and B, being by your dishwasher. Those may not, either one of those things, both of those together result in very little uptake in those programs. If I'm in my car and I get a message saying, come somewhere and discharge, we will compensate you, that's really interesting. In order to do that, you need real-time location, which is where Shiva, this is our bread and butter, that's our patented technology. So all those batteries, if I'm the power grid, if I could see where they are, all those cars, if I could see where they are in real time, I got a better shot at using this. Then that brings to the point where, we've talked about public-private partnerships. The other big elephant in this room are the regulated monopoly utilities. They all want to run out and build charging infrastructure, or have tried to either rate base it or whatever they want to do, because they want the power load. They lose it because somebody puts solar panels on their roof. Therefore, they lose the sale of that electricity. They would like to find it another way. Oh, well, all of these new appliances that are driving around need to be charged. We could do that. Is that the most logical? Like, how do you see those, the utility and a city working together on that front? Because it's a pretty fraught relationship, especially in California, as we know. You can carve utility out of space. Doug, I know this is your background too, so maybe I'll go to you on this one to start.
So I first want to say that California's again, and we seem to always be the crash test dummy for new ideas. When we've kind of carved out these community choice aggregation, community choice energy organizations that complement our 3 investor-owned utilities. We have Pacific Gas and Electric, SoCal Edison, and San Diego Gas and Electric. And the investor-owned utilities are really, their primary focus has to be the safety, reliability, and level of service provided by the conventional grid, right? Now it's obviously a fraught relationship, because the more demand you add onto the grid through the community choice groups that are trying to accelerate, electrify everything, kill natural gas. We're not paid to worry about that, so let's make everything electric. It just adds more pressure on the grid. So personally, I'm not seeing investor-owned utilities feeling a whole lot of, or at least not in California, feeling a whole lot of incentive to own the charging market. Here, it's more the community choice groups that want to focus on proliferation of renewables and storage assets, and B, really push forward on electrifying buildings and fleets, and making that a primary asset. So I guess I don't see the IOUs here being the main driver of EV charging infrastructure from that standpoint. I think it's the community choice groups that are trying to do this for their purposes of electrifying as much as they possibly can.
and for those folks who don't know what a community, if it's, we tend to throw out a lot of terms in the energy business. Community charge aggregation is basically a municipal utility that's carved out of the investor-owned utilities backyard, usually by a state law. I'm in New York now. We have the same laws on our books here. Gary, from your perspective on that, like, because you're, educating cities about this now, what do you see the interaction between the investor-owned, like a regulated utility or investor-owned utility, and the city discussions you're having?
It's really interesting. I'll use someone like ComEd here in Chicago. More and more of ComEd, Ameren, all these utility operations, they're investing in solar farms. They're looking at all this farmland that's out here. And more recently, we've been trying to get them out of the farmlands and onto buildings. So we're looking at the tops of these city buildings to develop these farms, and these utilities want to install them. They want to manage them because they see that as an alternative to losing out on their clients that are going to go solar or whatever. Another thing I'm seeing in the cities is like Lion Electric putting out all those school buses, electric school buses, and the cities are starting to figure out, working with the school districts, what are those buses doing in the summertime when they're not being used, and they store all that electricity, and can we buy that back? Can we use it to do something else? So there's a lot of innovation coming out of all this, but I'm seeing the utilities getting more excited about what they see as their competition being solar and investing heavily in that. And I'm seeing the oil, like Shell and others, investing in the charging stations and charging infrastructure. I'm working with Shell right now, Shell Recharge, and that's their goal. They're going is they're going to be switching over to where they realize they need to invest in that technology going forward.
It's a bit of a wild west on who gets the chunk of the energy budget, right? X percent of energy came from oil and natural gas before, and then it went into small, cars and light trucks. Now, the power grid's a player in a market that only somebody with a refinery was a player in before, right? So it's an interesting battle. I'm going to get one more question. We got some questions coming in from the audience, and I want to leave some time for that. But one last question, and Gary, you touched on it a little bit. A third of, and this is not just a San Francisco thing. I use San Francisco as the example, but it plays out across most big North American cities, frankly. When they look at parking revenue, 1/3 of it is you putting quarters or putting your credit card or using an app to activate a parking meter. Mm-hmm. 2/3 is enforcement. So in other words, tickets. And so for all those people always think like, there's a ticket quota in my neighborhood. I know they're trying to write tickets because of, that whole urban myth. I don't know how much of an urban myth it might actually be. So how do you, and of course, if you go to a city and say that, they'll go, well, Trevor, then it's going to cost $1 for 15 minutes to replace that revenue. Parking at a parking meter will be $1 every 15 minutes. And people will freak out, right? That will be the public perception of like, what happened to my quarter being worth something to this is more expensive. How do you take an opportunity in EV charging where the time you're bending a whole lot of new things, you're bending time, you've got a whole new generation of infrastructure. How do you take advantage of that to sort of re-educate people about the value, frankly, the value of that public parking spot? Gary, I'll go to you on this one to start.
Well, looking from the city's perspective, going back to looking at someone like San Francisco, we talked about earlier, some of the things that awareness is that we don't realize is that it costs for every dollar that someone like San Francisco has to go out and try to collect that's delinquent or hasn't been paid can cost $3. So they're actually coming out behind going after that. So they want to look for solutions where they're not dealing with that. So they want to look for solutions where when they have these parking meters, that's why you see a lot of them converted to credit cards. So they don't have to worry about people sticking quarters and jamming them and saying it's not my fault, that type of thing. But in reality, the downtimes are really just an opportunity. I think, I don't know, to me, that I think what lacks in cities is awareness and education. And I'm kind of going to go sideways a little bit on you on this, but I think it's important to keep in mind is I'm working with some high schools and community colleges, and we're attracting students that maybe don't want to go on to a 4-year college, and so we're putting together curriculum that helps them learn how to work on electric vehicles, how to install charging stations, how to install solar panels, and so forth. And so a lot of the what I would call available time as opposed to downtime is just getting that awareness out to the community. And I don't see a lot of that right now. And when we do, we get inundated with questions from potential students and their parents and businesses and manufacturers that want to draw that as their employees workforce in the future. So I know it's kind of a little sideways to what you're asking, but that's kind of one of the things that I was focusing on.
Fair enough. Good points, Doug. Do you have anything to add on that one?
Well, I mean, first I'd say, a really effective mass transit system would probably earn a hell of a lot more revenue than some parking tickets.
Yep.
But you didn't ask me that, did you? I do think, and Gary, sorry for the real-time question here, but I believe that Chicago is working with a company called Populous. You may have heard of Populous,
Yes.
right? We love them. And the idea that you can monetize more of the curb means there's perhaps less pressure to worry about the parking fines, and that's good. I think, although I'm not an expert in this, certainly with the increased certainty of payment because of credit card charges and such, you can start to create a very, very, very disincentivized system for keeping your car there too long. That's number one, going to pay you, and number two, doesn't feel like a fine where you have to pay somebody to go, look at it and create a ticket, right? So I think there's some ways that we can kind of change that game that are worthwhile. Tying this back to smart cities. I mean, if there is a way to incentivize, hey, if you use public parking and use public charging, you're going to get a benefit because, of some of the things we've talked about today. I think that it starts to look like a way that we can increase parking as a public service and stop thinking of it as a, a necessity that you can get fined for using too much.
Right. Fair enough. And that's yeah, exactly. That getting rid of that customer service viewpoint that is punitive in some ways is probably a good, or there's punishment awaiting you for using it sometimes. Great. And so I wanted to get in a question here from the audience. I know we're down to our last few minutes here, but and they aimed this at you, Doug, but I'll ask Gary to chime in too. But first to you. Speaking of your first mover disadvantages, do you think that the current charging technology is suited to mass deployment? Will wireless charging or some other variant be better and a more practical solution? That's very interesting. Very interesting question. What do you think?
So I'm first going to say hello to Brian Bartholomew's from the Tomcat Center at Stanford University. Thank you for your question, and it's good to see your name. Good. I hope to see your face sometime again. I think that we're kind of in the fully connected charging or conductive charging. Inductive charging is being looked at. There's certainly experiments with things like charging lanes and all that. I don't think that the jury is out, but I think if you say if it's suited for mass deployment, it's mass deployed now. So it is what it is. We have what we have, and I think that it does work. I think the biggest issue is it only in most cases works in one direction, and we haven't figured out how to make it a more valuable asset. So conductive versus inductive, I'd probably stick with conductive because it is safer and more intuitive, but I think we have to increase the utility of that asset somehow.
Fantastic. Gary?
I agree with what Doug is saying and referencing that. I think that, if you go Google Peachtree at Georgia, they've got their smart roads program that they're doing, and they're so far behind. Unfortunately, it's very costly, and it's way out there. And then you've got Australia that's got those 3D printed solar panels that you can roll out and charge your car and so forth. There's just so much technology coming out there. But for now, I agree with Doug. What we have, it's already out there, and that's going to probably be what we have to work with for now, at least for the next 5 years.
I just add my 2 cents to that. I think we're just kind of coalescing around a plug that everybody agrees on. And that there's it's a little bit of beta versus the old Betamax question. And it's challenging, right? And we're coming to terms with that. And then so that in something new, we're like, okay, well then every automaker's got to agree on the tech. So to make that work for everybody. So, that just has its own challenges. I love the idea of inductive charging, really. I love the idea of charging on the fly, but it's too many tech curves at once, baby.
I will say that there are new variants on this coming out, and that used to be an okay term. So I'm sorry, I don't want to bring in viral images here, but I would encourage people to look up a little startup called It's Electric. I am not a shareholder in It's Electric, but it's ITS Electric. They're thinking of a charging station that is more, it's connected to your home, but it's at the curb. But it's a very durable, really interesting way of looking. It's designed by an architect from New York who's very good. And there's also been some work on undercarriage type charging. Again, you got to get everybody to agree, and when you start talking about the cycles for vehicle design, this becomes very difficult, right? So I mean, people I think are thinking that the current form factor on a station may need to change, and maybe the smarts need to change. But I think we're going to be plugging in for quite some time.
Oh, very good. Well, guys, that's it. We have run out of time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Especially thanks to Doug Davenport, Prospect SV, Gary King of the EV Alliance. Thanks, guys, for joining us. We will have this will be available again on YouTube in a week. Don't forget, we also have a podcast with my colleague Jack Van Way, who's behind the scenes here. You can't see him behind the curtain, but he is helping me out. We do that on a monthly basis. Some interesting interviews there as well. You can find us on Spotify and that New Car Sense. That is the name of the podcast. And so for myself, Trevor Kerwin, Director of Partnerships at Shiva, and all my colleagues on the Shiva team and our guests today, thank you for joining us. And feel free to follow up with anybody with questions as well. We hope to be talking to you soon, and we'll let you know when the next one's ready. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Jack.
All right. Take care. Thank you.